So here's a pretty unsettling question. Are we watching one of the world's oldest democracies begin to fail? That's really the core idea in the book How Democracies Die by Stephen Levitsky and Daniel Ziblatt. And their whole argument is that we might be looking for danger in all the wrong places. You know, when we think of a democracy falling, we tend to picture something really specific, really dramatic.
We picture this, the scene from the movies, a full-blown military coup, generals in the streets, tanks rolling up to the presidential palace. It's a swift, violent, unmistakable ending. And this isn't fiction. It's exactly how democracy died in Chile in 1973. For a very long time, this was the textbook way a democracy would collapse. But here's the twist Levitsky and Ziblatt present. That kind of dramatic, obvious coup, it's becoming a thing of the past. They argue that today, the biggest threats don't come from generals with tanks. They come from elected leaders, presidents and prime ministers, who use the very machinery of democracy to slowly, and often legally, tear it down from the inside.
Okay, so to really get our heads around this modern threat, we're going to follow the book's roadmap. First, we'll cover how democracies die differently now. Then, we'll get into their authoritarian litmus test. Next, we'll talk about democracy's soft guardrails, which are super important. After that, we'll look at what the authors call the Great Unraveling. And finally, we'll see what politics looks like when those guardrails are gone. All right, let's jump right in with that first big idea, this fundamental shift from military coups to something that happens in courthouses. It's all about moving away from that sudden, violent seizure of power to a slow, almost invisible erosion from within.
Think of it this way. The old method is like a heart attack. It's sudden, it's shocking, and you absolutely cannot ignore it. The new way, which the authors call executive aggrandizement, is a lot more like a chronic disease. You have leaders like Hugo Chavez in Venezuela or Alberto Fujimori in Peru who are elected fair and square. But once they were in office, they used legal tools, packing the courts, silencing the media, rewriting the rules, to slowly dismantle all the checks and balances, one by one. And because it doesn't happen all at once, well, that's the danger. There's no single moment of crisis. So people often don't realize their democracy is dying until it's way too late.
So if the real threat is coming from leaders that we, the people, actually elect, then the million-dollar question is, how do you spot them before the damage is done? That's where the book gives us this incredibly useful tool, a 4-point litmus test for spotting authoritarian behavior. This is their crucial diagnostic kit, and they really stress that a politician doesn't need to check all 4 boxes. Even one is a major red flag. So what are we looking for? First, do they reject the basic rules of the game? Suggesting they'll ignore the Constitution or cancel elections. Second, do they deny their opponent's legitimacy, calling them traitors or enemies of the state? Third, do they tolerate or even encourage violence? And finally, are they eager to curb civil liberties, like attacking the press or protesters? What's so powerful about this is that it moves us past simple policy disagreements and gets to the real heart of the matter, a politician's basic commitment to democracy itself. If you want a perfect, almost unbelievable example of that first indicator, just look at this quote from Huey Long, the populist governor of Louisiana back in the 30s. When a lawmaker challenged him on constitutional grounds, Long's response was simple: "I'm the Constitution, just now." I mean, that's not just arrogance. That's a leader saying out loud that he is above the rules of the game. Okay, so if we can spot these dangerous leaders, what's supposed to stop them from getting power in the first place? Well, according to the book, the answer is what they call democracy's soft guardrails. These are the critical, unwritten rules that are meant to keep politics from just spinning out of control into a total war. Now, the first line of defense historically was the political parties themselves. The authors call this gatekeeping. For most of American history, party leaders basically acted like filters or bouncers at a club. They worked to keep figures they thought were dangerous, even really popular ones, off the ticket and away from any real power. And this really highlights a huge trade-off. Before the 1970s, you had party bosses choosing candidates in literally smoke-filled rooms. Now, was that democratic? No, not really, but it was a very effective filter. After reforms in the 70s, binding primaries gave the power to the voters. That's way more democratic, right? But it also meant those gatekeepers lost all their power. Now, an outsider with enough charisma or money could just go straight to the voters and completely bypass the party establishment. But okay. Let's say a potentially dangerous leader gets past the gatekeepers. There are 2 other critical, unwritten rules that are supposed to keep the whole system stable. The first is mutual toleration. And this is such a simple but profound idea. You have to accept that your political opponents are not traitors. They're just legitimate rivals who also love their country. The second one, which is closely related, is institutional forbearance. The absolute best way to understand forbearance is this pickup basketball analogy from the book. The Constitution, that's the basic rules. That's the court and the hoop. But the game only actually works because of all the unwritten norms. You call your own fouls, but you don't call every little bump. You have the power to try and block every single shot, but you don't, because it would just ruin the game for everybody. Political forbearance is exactly that. It's self-restraint. It's not using all of your legal powers to their absolute destructive limit just because you can.
So, what happens when these guardrails, the gatekeeping, the mutual toleration, the forbearance, what happens when they start to break down? This is where the authors apply their whole framework to recent American history in a section they call The Great Unraveling.
And you can see this timeline shows that progression pretty clearly. It starts with those 1972 reforms that weakened the party gatekeepers. Then you get figures like Newt Gingrich in the late 70s, who openly treated things like bipartisan cooperation as a form of surrender. Fast forward to 2010, the Citizens United ruling opens the floodgates to outside money, making the parties even weaker. And then by 2016, you see this just massive break in forbearance when the Senate refused to even hold hearings for a Supreme Court nominee, holding a seat open for almost a year.
All of this led to a massive shift. That norm of mutual toleration just withered away. The book points out how Newt Gingrich, for example, would give out memos with lists of words to describe Democrats, words like traitors, sick, and anti-family. Suddenly, the goal wasn't just to defeat your opponent in an election. The goal was to destroy them, to question their very right to be in the game. Politics wasn't a competition anymore. It had become a state of war.
And that brings us to the final, and frankly, pretty scary part of this whole thing. What does politics actually look like when those soft guardrails of toleration and forbearance are just gone? The authors call it a fight to the death.
The book uses North Carolina as a really stark case study of what this looks like in practice. After one party won control, they started playing what's called constitutional hardball. That means using every single legal tool at your disposal to lock in your power. They gerrymandered districts with what a court literally described as surgical precision to water down their opponent's votes. They passed new laws to make it harder for specific groups to vote. And then, this is the real shocker, after they lost the governor's race, the old legislature held a special session just to pass laws that would strip the new governor of his powers. Now get this, none of this was technically illegal, but it completely violates the spirit of forbearance. It's using the letter of the law to kill the spirit of the game.
And this beautiful quote from E.B. White just gets to the absolute heart of what gets lost. Democracy isn't just a bunch of rules on paper. It's a culture. It's about restraint, civility, trust. It's the don't in don't shove. And when forbearance and mutual toleration disappear, well, the shoving begins.
And this is the profound challenge that the authors leave us with. They're very clear that simply turning back the clock isn't an option. Those old norms that kept the peace for so long were often built on a foundation of exclusion, so just going back to that isn't the answer. The real question for our time is this: can we build new democratic guardrails? Can we create new norms of respect and restraint that are genuinely inclusive enough for a truly diverse modern democracy? According to the book, that answer is still being written.